The fight for women's suffrage in the United States is often told as a story of unity and triumph, but for African American women, it was a battle waged on two fronts, against both gender and racial oppression. While suffragists like Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton are widely celebrated, Black women brought their own strength and resilience to the movement, despite often being overlooked. Undeterred, they fought on, knowing that the right to vote was not just about civic participation but about survival, dignity, and justice. Ida B. Wells was one of the fiercest warriors in this struggle. Born into slavery in 1862 in Mississippi, she was raised in the shadow of Reconstruction, a time when Black political progress was swiftly met with backlash. Wells was an investigative journalist, but her mission was much greater. She spent her life documenting and exposing the terror of lynching in America, writing with an unflinching truth that many tried to silence. She understood that political power was essential to dismantling the structures of racial violence, and for that reason, voting rights were central to her activism. Despite her contributions, the mainstream suffrage movement was riddled with racism. Many other suffragists were willing to abandon Black women in order to gain support from Southern politicians who feared Black political power. At the 1913 Women's Suffrage Parade in Washington, D.C., organizers demanded that Black women march at the back of the procession, separate from their counterparts. But Ida B. Wells refused. Dressed in white, she defiantly stepped into the ranks where she belonged, ensuring that Black women were not erased from the movement they had helped build. Mary Church Terrell was another leading force in this fight. Born to formerly enslaved parents in 1863, she was one of the first African American women to earn a college degree. Education, she believed, was key to liberation. She co-founded the National Association of Colored Women, an organization dedicated to advancing Black women's rights, including the right to vote. While other suffragists often argued for women's suffrage as a means of moral uplift, Terrell framed it as a necessity for racial justice. She traveled the country delivering powerful speeches that reminded America that Black women, too, had a stake in democracy. Her motto, "Lifting as we climb," embodied the spirit of the movement, an acknowledgement that no one could truly be free until all were free. Long before Wells and Terrell, Sojourner Truth had already laid the foundation for Black women's political activism. Born into slavery in 1797, she escaped to freedom and became a forceful advocate for abolition and women's rights. In 1851, at a women's rights convention in Ohio, she delivered her famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?" Her words challenged the prevailing notion that womanhood was defined by fragility, a stereotype that excluded Black women. She reminded her audience that she had worked just as hard, endured just as much, and deserved just as many rights as any white woman. Her voice rang with truth, but many white suffragists were uncomfortable with her presence. Some even attempted to erase her from suffrage history. Yet her words endured, passed down through generations, fueling the continued fight for equality. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper was another Black woman whose pen became her weapon. A poet, abolitionist, and suffragist, Harper used her literary talent to challenge injustice. In 1866, she stood before the American Equal Rights Association and boldly declared that Black women faced a double burden, oppressed for both their race and their gender. She was one of the few suffragists who warned that if Black women were not included in the fight, true democracy would never be achieved. Her words were prophetic. Even after the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, granting women the right to vote, Black women, especially in the South, continued to be disenfranchised by Jim Crow laws, poll taxes, and literacy tests. These women were not anomalies. Across the country, countless Black women mobilized their communities, ensuring that the right to vote was not just won, but exercised. Nannie Helen Burroughs and Hallie Quinn Brown worked to politically educate Black women, while activists like Charlotte Maxseek in South Africa and Funmilayo Ransom Kuti in Nigeria led parallel struggles against colonial rule and gender oppression. Their fight was never just about the ballot, it was about ensuring that Black voices long silenced were heard in the halls of power. Their legacy did not end with them. The seeds they planted grew into the civil rights movement, where women like Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and Diane Nash continued the struggle for political representation. When Fannie Lou Hamer stood before the 1964 Democratic National Convention and exposed the brutal reality of black voter suppression, she was echoing the same fight that Ida B. Wells had waged decades earlier. And when Stacey Abrams led massive voter registration efforts in Georgia in the 21st century, she stood on the shoulders of Mary Church Terrell and Frances Harper. The story of suffrage is incomplete without these women. They were often ignored, dismissed, and erased, yet they shaped history in ways that cannot be undone. Their courage, their defiance, and their unyielding belief in justice ensured that the fight for democracy was not just for some, but for all. And because of them, the march forward never stops.